Welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. This is our 39th webinar in our series, and so far our webinar has been viewed in over 100 countries, and we've just been really pleased and impressed with such a diverse community and how that has developed over the past several months. Just a couple of quick notes to those who are watching on live stream. We encourage you to use the chat stream to introduce yourselves, connect with each other, share resources, and pose questions for those here gathered in our Google Plus Hangout. The URL for our public group notes Google Doc for today should be included in the live stream chat. And we'd like your assistance in capturing highlights and sharing resources related to today's very important topic, which can be kind of characterized in this question: what effects and impacts are out-of-school learning spaces having on formal education institutions? So we're really honored today to be joined by just a group of really interesting figures and researchers and practitioners, and looking forward to today's discussion. Before our guest speaker, Julian Sefton-Green, takes the floor to help frame our conversation for today, I wanted to give everyone here in the Hangout a brief opportunity to introduce yourselves and just to let everyone know who you are and what you bring to this conversation. Andres, can we start with you?
Sure. Hello, my name is Andres Lombana. I am a PhD student in Media Studies at UT Austin. I work with the Digital Edge project, researching media ecology of youth. Especially, I focus on Latino youth, and I have been studying like 2 after-school programs in a public high school.
Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. My name is Jen Vadabone-Kerr, and I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I'm interested in studying and exploring both kind of on my own and also with young people informal contexts and the learning that goes on in informal contexts, and thinking about making connections between the lessons that we learn about learning in informal contexts and trying to bring some of those lessons back to more formal settings.
Kylie?
Hi, I'm Kylie Pepler. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University. I'm in the Learning Sciences program, and my research really involves the intersection of studying learning at the intersection of arts, new media, and informal learning spaces. And so I'm delighted to kind of have this conversation today about the value of learning in these spaces.
Hi, Lissa. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Lissa Soeb, and I have 2 different roles that might be relevant here. So one is I'm research director and a senior producer at Youth Radio in Oakland, and I founded our mobile action lab there. And I'm a member of the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network that MacArthur has back to kind of take a look at how digital and social media are transforming the way young people express voice and influence in the public sphere.
Great. So as you can see, a really fantastic group here today, and really looking forward to the conversation that ensues. But before that, I'd like to give the opportunity and the floor, rather, to our guest for today, Julian Sefton-Green, who, just let me say a few things about Julian. He's an independent scholar and currently a part-time principal research fellow at the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics. Julian wears many hats. He's also a research associate at the University of Oslo and an honorary professor of education at both the University of Nottingham and Hong Kong Institute of Education. And I should also add that Julian has been working very closely with Sonia Livingstone via the Connected Learning Research Network, and doing a fantastic ethnographic study of some students in the London area. So looking forward to learning more just about the wonderful work you're doing, but more importantly, a recent paper that has been published as part of the Digital Media and Learning series by the MacArthur Foundation. So Julian, we'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Craig, Cyril, and Jen and Andreas, Kylie and Lissa. It's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't done a webinar before, but I think I'm going to be able to cope with the idea of just talking impersonally to a computer and imagining that there are millions of people listening. And thank you ever so much also to John Baroloni, who's the community manager at MacArthur and kind of makes all these things work. Well, I guess to be fair, we'll see what happens before we know whether it actually works or not. So what I want to do to kick us off is talk a little bit about some of the ideas that underpinned the little publication that I just produced, which I have here, which is called Learning at Not School, a review of study theory and advocacy for education in non-formal settings. And I've done a number of things in my life. I've been a school teacher, I've worked in teacher training, and I spent some time working in community arts, working in an out-of-school centre. So raising money and dealing with young people, setting up activities, employing staff, that kind of thing. But I've also always been interested in what we mean by the learning that we presume to go on in these centres. And in recent years, a number of countries all around the world have been investing new kinds of money. MacArthur itself is very interested through the Digital Media Learning Initiative in developing out-of-school learning and supporting particularly the uses of digital media in semi-structured and in some cases quite highly structured informal education kind of contexts. Obviously, there's a continuum between the desire to set up these kind of social community-based centres and what we also now are very interested in studying, which is the capacities for young people to get involved in making and consuming media and participating in a wide range of cultural activities and civic activities with each other informally in bedrooms, with their friends, with their peers. But I was particularly interested in trying to think through what it means to talk about the learning that exists in funded, organised, out-of-school centres. And I use the phrase not school because one of the things that I've been very interested in is the ways in which these places are voluntary. We don't exactly know how many people get the opportunity to go to these kinds of places. But they are also a school that is not a school. They are in some ways kind of organised activities in that kind of way. A couple of the other themes that I wanted to introduce in the little booklet were, one, the desire to bring in international and comparative perspectives. Because although these kinds of centres exist in many countries around the world, I actually think that how the different countries have different expectations of what these kind of centres can achieve and how they can be sustained within different local contexts. And we tend to imagine, I think, that the way things are in our own country is the way things are universally. And I think one of the things I'm trying to provoke is to get us to challenge and think that through. Another kind of thing I've been particularly interested in is, besides the challenge of identifying and describing what we might mean by learning in these out-of-school settings, is also to raise a question that this isn't actually an area of study that is very stable and very recognized by university researchers or in the academy. In my country, in England, and the kind of history that I had, a lot of the funding for these centres is very hit and miss. It's a fashion. A particular politician likes something. The money comes, the money goes, that kind of thing. So one of the things I also wanted to do was to try and get us to think historically about the ways that these kinds of centres have had their moment, that these kind of activities have had a particular kind of moment in the sun. And also to go back to some of the research that has been written and has been studied and produced from these kinds of centres so that we don't have this terrible moment of forgetting. Because a lot of the studies of out-of-school centres does tend to focus on some of the practical problems about the question of delivery, sustainability, and funding. And these are very important questions, obviously, but they often tend to distract scholars and community from having a more consistent long-term view of what we might think are the achievements and the learning that goes on in these kinds of places. I called the little booklet Learning at Not School, partly because I want to get us to think about the ways in which the everyday of schooling, the things that that's been called the grammar of schooling, the everyday features of schooling, precisely the things that we know often turn kids off, the kind of discipline, the kind of problem of breaking up subjects into fixed times during the day, and all the sorts of things that we know can be excluding for many young people in school. Nevertheless, what's interesting, one of the things about these out-of-school centres is they tend to use school as the kind of benchmark against which they measure themselves. And one of the things that's interesting about them is how they play with the way that school is organised in order to set themselves up differently. And I think this is an important thing, an important feature to think about, how not school engages with school and how it has an impact on what goes on within the more formal education system. In the little booklet, I outline three kind of areas that I think traditionally have lain behind research into out of school. First of all, a focus on context, so where the learning takes place. So rather than going to a specialized school place, a lot of these centers are in the community, often in public housing, in informal kind of locations. And they're often in very specialized locations, particularly when they're to do with certain kind of art forms where the studio expertise and the kind of place that it's in is part of the kind of learning that's going on. The second main focus is around the learners themselves and how learners themselves often set the agenda, that their interests and their motivation are what it's about, but also how their social selves, the development of themselves, is the kind of key focus for these out-of-school centres. And the third kind of theme here is around the different kinds of knowledge that get explored in out-of-school centres. One very interesting theme, it seems to me, is that digital media learning isn't very well entrenched in the school system. But if you look at the history of photography and video, which often now have a much better, a more formal place in the school curriculum, you can actually see how learning in out of school acts in a kind of R&D way, that it's a kind of test bed for developing forms of curriculum that eventually find their place back in the school. Of course, one of the real problems from, and this is one of the real problems that goes on with thinking about learning in out of school, is the more that we get involved in researching and studying and following the learning that's going on there, the more we run the risk of formalizing the informal. And this is the kind of central paradox to the problem, that the more that society as a whole invests in out-of-school learning, in out-of-school centres, and that it gets kind of, it starts to believe that these out-of-school centres can do the things that school can't do, it runs the very risk of destroying the spirit and the kind of practice which makes those kind of out-of-school centres interesting in the first place. And this, it seems to me, is a real kind of tension in any kind of analysis about the contribution that the out-of-school sector can make to education in general. In the booklet, I looked very briefly at some of the real problems that lie behind our understanding of the sector. So there's it's an area that hasn't been well researched. We don't know very many basic facts. We don't know about sort of broad attendance features and the kinds of people that go there. Secondly, we also don't know much about the equity issues. One of the things about the out-of-school sector, when it is publicly funded and available to communities at large, is to an extent it's kind of competing with the whole range of privately funded out-of-school learning that we know that young people from middle-class and affluent families get access to. But there's no way that there's a good enough research base to know about the balance between kids from well-off homes and kids from not-so-well-off homes, and how attending and having access to out-of-school learning in different kind of contexts can be followed through. The third kind of problem in researching this field is we don't know much about people's use of moments and episodes in their lives. So often, typically, young people might go to out of school or be involved in community arts kind of education for extended periods that can be quite intense and kind of meaningful. But we don't know how this kind of then impacts back on what happens to them at school, or how they then go on to, and what the progression routes are to further or higher education. And the final thing I want to say is that whilst there is quite a lot of writing about the out of school learning sector, I'm not terribly impressed by some of the range or rigor of the research involved. And this is partly because the sector is so kind of fragile. This often means that a lot of the research that gets used in and is commissioned in these fields is often quite, it has an advocacy function. it's very difficult when you get a one-off shot to kind of assess what's been going on in your center, to write something that might be negative or might be challenging or might be difficult. And this kind of contributes to a rather difficult, contributes to the difficulty we have in making stable judgments that we can be sure about the value of this sector in young people's lives and further on. And this is also a problem because it's actually very difficult to get assessments of what might be thought of as the average quality of a day or a session at a community centre. How do we have any sense of where the learning might be quite good but not good enough? That there are very few metrics and ways of measuring these kinds of assessment, and that kind of approach tends to be lost in the desire to produce an account of change. And this is also particularly problematic because many of the accounts of change that we are used to looking at out-of-school learning often revolve around quite personal, social, individual developments, because there are often other kinds of aims to these not school learning centres, as they should be quite properly. And these are often revolve around allowing people to develop confidence, interact with other people, play a part in their community, work with others, very general kind of social, personal things that many of us believe in, but for some reason we seem to live in a world where education systems tend not to find a way of measuring those kinds of things and valuing them. I think I am actually, I don't know, how long have I been talking for, Craig?
A little over 10, 12 minutes or so.
Okay, all right. I'm going to draw to a close then in terms of me talking at you all, whoever's there. So I think I want to leave with the challenge whilst on the one hand, I think we all need more research and a more secure base to think about the kinds of learning that go on in these centres and the kinds of teaching, the kinds of skills required by staff and adults who work with young people, or even the ways in which young people themselves can act as educators in these kind of contexts. Mm-hmm. I also wonder about what's at stake for a society that wants to invest in these out-of-school centres, and whether we're expecting these out-of-school, these not-school centres to carry too much hope for us, that in some ways, given that in many places, school itself is not an institution that we tend to have much faith in, are we just doubling the risk here in trying to make out of school compensate for what some people's perceptions of the failures and challenges of schooling itself? And I think I'll leave it there in terms of the presentation. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Julian. That was, I think, very constructive in terms of a lot of the themes that you laid out for us to consider here. And I think given the hangout here, as well as others who may be looking, certainly probing questions that we'll take into the work that we're doing either as practitioners, as researchers, as critics, as educators. So thank you so much for laying out what I think are some really fundamental issues, challenges, and tensions that we're all grappling with in some shape, form, or fashion. What I'd like to do at this point is open it up to the Hangout. If there are any initial reactions to any of the themes or points or tensions that Julian noted, perhaps we can start the conversation there. There are some questions that are beginning to emerge from the live stream, some other prodding questions that we have to respond to as well. So any quick reactions or reflections from the Hangout?
Sure, Julian, at some point I'd love you to talk a little bit more about some of the sort of international and historical perspectives, I think, to ground our conversation. I think you hinted at them, but I think the broader audience would be interested in hearing more about that diversity, because I do think, particularly in the US, this gets very flattened to some sort of predominant models of after school that we kind of know and understand, such as the Boys and Girls Club or other types of models. But very little do we get to have a nod to the kind of diversity that you're talking about.
Shall I answer that question?
Sure.
Okay. Well, in several countries in Scandinavia, for example, youth provision is part of what the cities provide for young people as raised from tax dollars. So it's not additional funding that's provided by philanthropists and things like that. And there's a long tradition in Scandinavia of the youth centres being run by youth themselves. So the governance is absolutely by youth for youth kind of thing. And this has a kind of very different kind of take then on the kind of activities that are involved. In Norway, there's a provision for an out-of-school learning centre when you've kind of finished school. So if you want to kind of explore other kinds of things in that kind of way. In Germany, there are the youth work and what they call the social pedagogy is very, very kind of embedded in a range of kind of activities for young people of all ages, which is much more a kind of attempt to kind of involve young people in forms of social activity. So out of school learning isn't just something voluntary, something you'd go to because you want to go there. It's something that in a sense everybody might be expected to participate in as part of the wider kind of culture around what it means to kind of grow up and learn in a general sense.
Great. Yeah, I think that really starts to complexify things. That is some interesting examples there.
Great. Julian, is it okay if I jump in and ask a question? Okay, great. You know, I'm keenly aware of the way in which methodologies that we choose and methods that we choose influence the outcome of research. And I think by default, they influence what counts as learning. And so I'm just trying to think a little bit about how we could assess learning, or how we could study learning or explore it differently in a way that actually might reflect what we actually believe is learning, for example, right? So, and I'm just wondering if you could think a little bit or think with us or let me know your thoughts about any methodological things that we could do to make sure that the learning that we capture isn't simply reduced to really simple, the kinds of things, I apologize, this is my bias, the kinds of things that I think we actually capture when we use multiple choice tests and things I think are really simple pieces or proxies for learning potentially, but I'm just not interested in thinking about learning that way. So how would what would a good methodology be, or what methods could we use? And sorry, this is kind of a big question, but it's a burning question for me. How do we make sure that the methodologies that we use really capture what we think learning could be?
That's a very big question indeed. I think it's a very interesting question, and I would first of all say that I would want you all to chip in with answers to that as well. I don't know the answers. I do have a couple of pointers though. One is a lot of education research is notoriously short term. You have an initiative and you assess the impact of the initiative within a kind of fixed term. So you're looking for outcomes that kind of are the result of the input kind of thing. And this seems to me completely misplaced in looking at the values of out-of-school learning. So one of the questions, one of the methods that people need to explore is finding ways to have a lifelong and longer term kind of perspective. So what is happening to these young people who had such a great time with us in 5 years, in 10 years? There was one little study I saw about a project that dealt with, it was a project in a poor area in Bristol, and on a housing estate, a project, I think, housing projects, I think you call it. And it was particularly about, it was a project about male dancers. It was about getting young men involved in dance. And what the researcher did, which was really interesting, was he then went back and interviewed the young men when they were becoming fathers. And he talked to them about how the experience of the dance and being involved in that may or may not have made a difference to their whole experience of masculinity, of their identities, and how they became dads and young dads and things like this. And given that it's the values side of things that is often so important to participation in these things, we need to find ways to capture these values, which are only going to take place over the longer term. So where I come from in England, there's a lot of statistical stuff about involving keeping young people out of prison, stopping them reoffending, stopping them being involved in drugs and things like this. So it's a kind of simple metric, or they get a job and then you get the money as the deliverer if you can show they've got employment within 6 months. Well, these are very important, but actually they're not really what the point of it is. The point of it is, have we really affected somebody's employability over the long term? So we need to find forms of research that can really investigate some of these questions imaginatively, like I think the thing about being a dad, for example, which is like really important for obvious reasons. But also over the longer term, we need to find the people that have been through these centres that we think we made such a difference to and have had a good time. We need to find ways to go back to people, and we need to also find other things to look at, like that aren't just simple measurements like employability. How does competence change your ability to hold down a job and things like this? If these are the values we care about, we have to take a proper perspective, proper time perspective. And I think so long-term and life history kind of work, and looking at the different kind of routes and trajectories and mapping the kind of different pathways over a much longer perspective are some of the ways that I would suggest. But I think you've all got answers to that as well.
Yeah, and I know there are a number of us here in the Hangout who kind of on the front edges, so to speak, in terms of doing this work. And at least, Jim, when I think about your question, part of what it compels me to consider is, to what extent, if at all, do these kind of not school, informal, out of school learning spaces, do they provide opportunity to define learning in very different ways in terms of what young people actually do, what they're expected to do, what they're permitted to do? And so I'm just curious if there may be others who have examples of work that they've done or experiences they're aware of where learning has been kind of fundamentally turned on its head, something that's more experiential, something more hands-on, the kinds of things that move away from objective tests, that move away from short answer essays, and that really make learning something that's tangible, that's hands-on, experiential, and dynamic, and what really draws young people to these spaces in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this hints at that we have an underlying framework for what learning is constituted. And so a lot of it has to come from our disciplinary conceptions of learning. And so, what is science or writing or the disciplines that have been sort of in our K-12 and higher education spectrums. And I think as we move away from that, and I think the new criteria we're talking about is sort of these lifelong criteria, so Julian's offering, what does it mean to be a dad, things that we should value as a society, not just these disciplinary content. It gets us to sort of re-envision things that we might look for in our assessments. I think specifically, digital media offers so many new opportunities, which I think is a lot of fun, that to look at learning in different ways, that these traces, these portfolios that youth are creating, there's longevity there, and they have so much voice in of themselves. And I think, Lissa, you could speak to this as well, that that it becomes this artifact that we can start to interrogate the learning experience, both in the short term, but then also in the long term, and kind of coming back to those things. And so, that basically what you're doing and how you're practicing and how you're participating can be a form of assessment rather than the standardized test or the abstraction that we might give to youth.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lissa, I know you've been really on the with Youth Radio, the work that you and others have been doing, is kind of squarely situated here. Any thoughts from you in terms of how learning has been kind of redefined, resituated in the spaces that you work with?
Sure. Well, actually, I did a piece for a book that Julian edited that was about methodologies for studying creativity, where we took up some of these same questions. And the argument that I tried to make there was that we do, like this group is sort of having some consensus about, need new methods for tracking learning over time, not just based on outcomes that we see in the lives of, young people 5-10 years later as they're experiencing life-changing events, but also tracing the products themselves that they create, and that notion of digital afterlife and how the products take on new meanings, the public sort of repurposes them in various ways, sometimes ways that the original authors never would have intended or predicted. And so that's also part of the ripple effects of the activities that might happen within a particular point in time that a researcher would capture. And the kind of resource that I turned to in that piece was multi-sited ethnography. So in other words, thinking about all the various sites that our young people move through, or that their products, that their media texts kind of circulate through once a project has been completed, and to use ethnographic methods to trace that over time. So we get past that problematic notion of the ethnographic present, which, you know, from anthropology, we know to be really problematic in the sense that traditionally anthropologists have sort of frozen people and culture in a particular time and place. And the work of analysis is captured in the ability for only the analysts to move on, right? And then look back at what happened and make sense of it. Whereas the people who are living in that moment are sort of frozen in time and place. So that's sort of more of an almost conceptual way of putting more urgency behind, I think, what we're all calling for. But the one question I would ask to just, it's interesting because being somebody who lives inside of these places all the time and has written about it, I actually am concerned about the opposite tendency in my own writing. And I don't think I'm alone in this, which is not boiling down the learning to these very reduced categories that align with what we measure in school, but almost the opposite, like that I can see so much richness, so much, you know, kind of literacy development and transformation happening in these moment-to-moment activities that I feel like sometimes I have to really challenge myself to make sure that I have evidence that's really having an impact in the lives of young people, like kind of the questions Julian's asking. So it circles back a little bit to Julian's point about this advocacy thread that can sometimes run through the work. Yeah, so Julian, you want to jump in?
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. The point I wanted to make is one of the, we don't want to replicate the problem that we have with schools where the voices of teachers and other kind of professionals is also kind of silenced in this kind of way. So there are loads of different kind of workers who work with young people in these kinds of centers. And one of the kind of key features, we don't want to professionalize the research to such an extent that we take the knowledge about them out of them. So your point about living with inside these places and things like that, I think this is, we need to kind of, given that what young people often say about these places is it's the interactions with the people that is so important, we have to find a way of kind of making those kind of connections more of a virtuous circle, that the values and voices of the range of people who work with young people is given voice and credibility, rather than some kind of academic administering something out of the picture in that kind of way as well.
Yeah, you know, I should note, just by way of a larger kind of framing context, that just yesterday it was announced here in the United States, Julian, that 5 states will be extending the school day. And there's been some pretty major investment from different organizations, including the Ford Foundation, which I think is about $3 million a year over the next 3 to 4 years or so, or something like that. But there is this idea, right, that by extending the school day, and in particular, sort of connecting to this issue of equity that you mentioned, my sense is targeting schools, targeting school districts, cities where students are probably attending low-performing schools. And so this idea, right, that by extending the school day, it might somehow begin to reverse some of these racial academic achievement gaps that we see. And so it seems to me that there are some interesting possibilities with this kind of intervention. But there are also some potential perils insofar as that you could see the potential of extending the school day into the so-called after-school space, but simply kind of reproducing in the extended day what happens during a typical day. And so hopefully, as we see initiatives like this grow and gain momentum, that there'll be some serious rethinking of how we might bring in the not school kind of dimension here. I'd like to shift gears if I can. Julian, you mentioned something that has kind of resonated on the live stream, and I'm sure here in the Hangout as well. And that is your if I can paraphrase here, this key tension or dilemma of formalizing the informal. And to what extent are we in danger of doing that when we bring in questions about learning outcomes, about measurements, about metrics, And if I can, let me just share a question or two from the live stream that get at this, and then I'll just turn it over to the Hangout to respond. So one question, for example, says, to what extent should out-of-school learning space organizers document results, structure the learning, and assess achievement? And then in another instance we have here, the idea that we need to measure outcomes and manage learning in out-of-school learning spaces. To what extent does that mess with or confound the original function of informal learning? And so I think for us, right, who we wear multiple hats here. We're practitioners, but we're also researchers, we're analysts. And so there is that compelling need to document and to support and to provide empirical evidence of the kinds of outcomes that we all envision in terms of these kind of new imagined spaces. But to the extent that it oftentimes requires then, creating some structure or semi-structure, to what extent does that begin to diminish or undermine some of the vitality that oftentimes sort of is the major draw for young people in terms of these spaces, the idea that they're not school. And if we insist on measuring, if we insist on structuring part of what happens, does the not school then in some instances become school?
How do we, what's the, okay,
so
I'll have a go.
Yeah,
it's
kind of open up to everyone.
A couple of points. There's clearly a tension between the needs of funders, and particularly where I'm used to, where the funding is state, it's public funding, and there are whole issues about accountability, because obviously people have to kind of find a way of accounting for that. And to say, oh, trust me, these kids are going to have a great time, it's going to make all sorts of differences to their lives, is not a satisfactory kind of solution anymore. But I think I completely agree with those questions. And I think they're things we should go into with our eyes open. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to try and help people kind of really reflect on how this tension has been analyzed in the past, because this isn't an original idea. And I also think I want to extend this challenge, because I know there's been quite a lot of work around the value of credentializing and certificating out of school learning. Now, again, the place I used to work at, in many of the courses, the young people said they didn't want certificates precisely because it made it too much like school. So we did actually develop a whole form of kind of, at graduation or the end of the year, we had sort of things like a reward for somebody who gave more than, how did it go? I can't remember, who gave more than they were given kind of thing. Or, so we had a sort of like an alternative kind of awards system in that way, because we wanted some way of recognizing achievement. But how we recognize achievement is very problematic. And obviously in the arts, where there's a tradition of performing and making, and therefore having this kind of interaction with an audience. So there's a kind of a notion of a genuine exchange of value. This is something that people have taken forward as being a more kind of authentic way to have a kind of real recognition of value than artificial forms of certification, which I think is going to be a risk in this sector.
Can I jump in with just a quick question in terms of, there's another institution here, I think, that plays a huge role in creating a mandate for assessment and sort of outcomes-based credentialing, and that's work. So we're assuming that the main kind of force that's pressing down on these centers is school, and the main point of comparison that kids and the people who work there are always making has to do with its relationship to school. But I just wonder how we account for the role of the workplace and sort of pathways and career readiness that are also put forth as kind of desirable outcomes for kids who are coming out of programs like the ones we're talking about. So that, for example, thinking about credentialing, when it feels like a token school-like activity, is kind of weak. But then absent of that, how do we offer an alternative to kids who are maybe not acquiring those credentials through the more traditional channels, who are doing some really incredible work in these non-school or not school spaces, and they want to be able to leverage that so they could actually be on a path towards living wage jobs? I don't think researchers are the ones that are creating the mandate for those credentialing systems. I think kids are, kids and their families and people who are working in spaces and wanting to see real opportunities come out of those activities.
And it seems like it's part of, if you think about badges, for example, right, and at least for some who are champions of badging, it's this idea, right, that it becomes a way of recognizing, of kind of validating and supporting and even kind of profiling the learning, the mastery, the skills that young people might develop outside of some formal learning context. So it becomes another way of signaling that someone has in fact developed the skills, the kind of market-ready skills or community-ready skills, whatever your sphere might be in terms of intervention or involvement. And so in that sense, you know, some type of measuring, some type of validation is important, but it becomes an alternative to the more traditional means of validation and awarding credit, i.e. school and diplomas, for example.
Well, I think this is also sort of where the arts have played a role in thinking about like portfolios and thinking about the work itself. You know, I mean, I think, Lisa, about the work that your youth are producing, right? You know, to be able to edit that down, to have something that you would showcase, you know, a YouTube video, whatever it is at this point, you know, that starts to communicate more than this abstraction about, you know, this award that you were given or not given, and you know, whether, you know, how valuable is it in that commodity, but really having, you know, a robust portfolio that really starts to speak for the amount of the investment, being able to have the articulate ability to put that into words, to kind of nail the job discussion. You know, I mean, I think test scores, credentials, they can get you in the door, but they don't necessarily cement that. And certainly, I think that there's lots of opportunities, you know, when you show somebody and say, hey, you know, I'd love to do some graphic design work for you, look at this portfolio I have, you know, to sort of meet the needs that are emerging in your own community. I think that, you know, we're sort of overlooking that value of really kind of pulling together the stuff that the youth are doing in the not school hours or in the school hours in a coherent way to really communicate to others at the workplace or elsewise.
Mm-hmm. But I think there's another tension here that I think goes back not just to the way that we assess kids, but also a methodology issue. Because I think like if you think about what's happening now with the longer school day, there's an assumption that just being in a particular place for additional time is going to fix kids or fix problems or fix social issues or whatever. There's some kind of an assumption like that underlying that movement. And I think we tend to really focus on kids for assessment, and we tend to focus on kids, and even in Marcus's multi-site ethnography, young people might be what's followed across different sites or different contexts. And I'm wondering if maybe the methodological issue is not necessarily studying a single young person as an individual, but trying to think about ways in which a methodology could capture relationships. So the methodology, the unit of analysis or the object of the methodology is about a particular young person with a particular adult, or with another young person, or a particular set of relationships. And then again, it's not assessing a young person's individual portfolio or individual exhibit, but the relationships that enabled that young person in relationship to have that creative experience. And I'm just thinking about, again, I keep getting drawn back to the methodology question, the methods question, because I don't want to kind of fall back on the default. But again, I'm still, it keeps things messy if we argue that what we really want to study is a relationship, and a relationship that moves across space and across time. And think about what Julian said about revisiting relationships over time potentially, and the effects. So I guess it's just more of it's still an open question. I'm wondering, especially I guess for Julian, to let me know what your thoughts are about that individual social dichotomy. How do we get away from that?
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think one of the things that I picked up looking historically at the literature is if you look at people like Milbury McLaughlin's work in the late 90s about assessing, studying kind of learning in outer school and community arts, community learning sites, what is very clear is there's much greater focus on community and the group and the collective as a kind of outcome, if you like, as a kind of measure of kind of success and achievement. And now there's much greater focus on individualized, personal kind of learning outcomes. And I think that's very interesting. I mean, that clearly shows a trend in society at large. But But it seems to me that given that one of the reasons we like out of school, societies like out of school learning and community arts, because they're interested in these community values, how could you, I think it's a very good question, how could you design a way of kind of measuring and accounting for the success of learning at a kind of collective kind of group or even area based? I mean, a lot of these centers are very location based. They're about a particular set of public housing or a particular neighborhood, those kinds of things. How could we look for kind of ways of crediting their kind of overall kind of social benefits in that kind of way without thinking just in terms of making, you know, competing individuals achieving things? And to pick up on a previous point that Lisa made, particularly about the value of qualifications, not just, you know, from our point of view, but from the young people. In England, there's been a terrible history of a failure to make vocational qualifications have any sense of parity with academic ones. You know, I don't know what it's like in the States, but basically there is a hierarchy of values at work here. And there's a genuine, I mean, a larger political question about how we can make forms of qualification more equal with each other and give credit and value. Otherwise, you're just going to have a sort of dual system of qualifications in that kind of way. I mean, I think, again, these aren't questions to which there are obvious answers, and that, you know, these are very complicated questions.
Yeah, you know, this is something that resonates in the work that we've been doing in Austin, and maybe Andres, you can maybe talk a bit about that. But that is, you know, a number of the students that we've had a chance to meet with and observe and interact with in sort of not school learning spaces in the field work that we've been doing, they actually view what they're doing in digital media clubs, for example, after school digital media clubs, cinematic arts projects that they're working on. They really see these as potentially sort of pathways into career, professional, and job opportunities. And so for them, it's very interesting, the narratives that they articulate in terms of what these spaces mean to them, why they resonate, in part because of what we might typically understand as they're not like school, and so it's an opportunity to be free, to be peer engaged, to be self-driven, peer-driven, all kinds of things. But Andres, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the just some of the complexities and contradictions that we're beginning to identify and grapple with in terms of some of the young people that we've been observing and working with?
Sure. I think it is very interesting to look at these not school programs or spaces in communities as the one that we have been studying, where the young people, they usually don't have access to technologies in their home environments. So not school becomes also a place to access, even if it happens inside the formal school, for instance, during after school hours. They find ways to engage with these spaces or this context, especially because they can have access to computers, to digital cameras, to software, and that they cannot access at home. So this issue of the different kind of or the inequalities in access becomes like crucial for these not schooling practices. And one of the things that becomes also difficult for these students or challenging is like when they are practicing there, sometimes they cannot complete many of their creations, and that is related to this question of assessment. And one thing that I was asking before in the chat, that is how can they create credentials by finishing and circulating their products? So maybe it's not, maybe if they have access to these spaces and can do like informal learning, they are not creating the right credentials that can translate into jobs, or they cannot access cultural or social capitals. But what becomes interesting here is also like how they are like using not school for learning and for accessing technologies that they cannot access at home.
And I think part of what we've been grappling with here, and Julian, this kind of comes back to a question that you raised, is the need to be careful about, I guess, how much faith we put into not school environments. So for many of the students that we've had a chance to meet and get to know really well, students who just strike us as bright, who strike us as having so much potential, but for whatever reasons, for a variety of reasons, have very sort of ambivalent at best attitudes towards formal schooling and what's happening in the school environment. but have a very different disposition when it comes to the after-school space. And yet we know how important formal schooling is and credentialing that comes to formal schooling is in terms of kind of post-secondary opportunities and the kinds of credentials that young people might be able to get in a variety of places, not necessarily four-year universities and colleges, but community colleges, internships, apprenticeships, a variety of ways in which they might find pathways to future opportunities in future workplaces, classrooms, and communities. And so it's something that you raised earlier is, as we begin to think about the importance of not school in these kinds of spaces, how should we also keep the role and context in relationship to these other pathways and opportunities for young people beyond school?
Hi. Yeah, I think this is another very important point. The center I used to work at, the URL is wac.co.uk, was particularly brilliant at offering a series of progressions to young people of all ages. So people might come, people might come from when they were really small. I mean, we had some programs for babies, and then we were also doing continuous professional development for artists who were up to 25. But young people could kind of circulate back through these centers. And so they might go off, they might come to us and work with us and then go back into further education, even higher education, and then come back. And I think part of the importance about not tying these kind of places down to single one-shot outcomes things is for them to be able to embrace a rich kind of totality of range of social experiences where you do sit at the hub of different kind of routes through to different opportunities, and they are involved at different kinds of levels. And this actually is a big challenge. It means trying to set up centers with a range of different kind of staff, a knowledge about multi-agency work and things like that. And also for the centers themselves to have a real kind of history and embeddedness within the kind of communities and within the kind of wider employment cultures that surround them in order to fulfill this kind of lifelong role in that kind of way, rather than thinking of them simply as a deliverer of course type A or course type B kind of thing. I think these are very big challenges, though.
We're approaching, and it's amazing how quickly an hour passes by, but we're nearing the end, and I wanted to, before we sign off, give everyone in our hangout just a final opportunity for any brief but final comments or questions that you'd like to share. Maybe starting with you, well, whomever wants to go.
I think I'll throw my hat in. I just think I think if I think about this kind of situation as kind of a messy problem, I think about it as dichotomously with schooling, where funding is kind of a given, and I think about these informal contexts as not available to everyone. So there are equity issues, there are funding issues, there are sustainability issues. I get very concerned with the messiness of it and very kind of discouraged sometimes. But I think one of the things that helps me to kind of get grounded and think more long term is to think about this as a problem of changing the culture of understanding learning, and really kind of asking people across different disciplines and different perspectives to re-engage with what the question of learning is, and really use that as the basis for the way in which we create contexts and ask kids to engage with us in those contexts, rather than assuming that learning is only done in school, or learning only looks like one thing, and learning is what's assessed on standardized tests or multiple choice tests, to really try to broaden what we think about learning to be, and also then kind of force ourselves to think about how to assess it differently, how to honor different contexts where different forms of learning surface, and then think about, I think we have to think about the equity issues, because young people don't have access to all of these different amazing experiences that we know exist. And how do we get kids access to these different amazing experiences? So I think if I think about changing the culture, and I recognize that this is a long-term project that has lots of different levers for change and lots of different transformative possibilities. I think that helps me get over some of the messiness out there.
Yeah, you know, Kylie, did I see
Yeah,
you?
yeah, no, I was just going to add to that. I think that those are some really nice points, Jen. And I think part of this idea of cultural context of schools and after school spaces is that I think one of the joys for youth is that they get to experience multiple cultural contexts. And so this idea of extending the school day and maintaining kids longer in a single context, I think is devastating to me, because I think, you know, it's just like traveling to a new country or, you know, starting a new job. It really gets you to see the world in a very different way. And so you know, it makes sense to me that, you know, some you know, cultural contexts really work for some kids, and that they have, you know, they should have the right to sort of explore these non-school spaces and see if they work for them, you know, to take something away from something that is, you know, completely culturally different than what they've experienced in school.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. You know, something that you said, Julian, that also resonated with some of the work that we've been trying to pilot and experiment with here in Austin is you talked about not school spaces as research and development, as really places where there's an opportunity to tinker and to kind of play around with new models of learning, new kinds of environments and spaces for learning. And it's something that I find really instructive. And I think in some ways it sort of aligns well with the whole vision of connected learning. And so if we think about not school spaces as just one node among many others in terms of a learning ecology that young people inhabit, and how do we begin to understand the different ways in which that node might impact or enable and empower new forms of learning. We maybe just as a final kind of prodding question, something else that's coming from the live stream, and the live stream has been buzzing here, is this question, and maybe we can end with this note. What does it mean to be successful in out-of-school spaces, and how can adults support youth in reaching their goals? I don't know if anyone wants to think out loud about that question. I know it's something that we're thinking a lot about here in Austin. In fact, we've been having extended meetings and conversations with our research team about what counts as success in spaces and environments like this. Or maybe we'll just leave that as sort of a curvature of a question mark for us all to consider. And there certainly are ample opportunities on the live stream chat to maybe respond to that. All of this will be archived, and so we look forward to continuing to have the opportunity to engage in these issues. So let me just say thank you to everyone. Julian, thank you so much for what I think is very important work, and work that's resonating around the world in some really interesting ways. And I think you're exactly right in terms of broadening and thinking about the international context and perspective is so crucial here in terms of really enriching how we think about these kinds of opportunities. So to keep today's conversation going, we encourage you to continue using the Twitter hashtag, which is #ConnectedLearning, and posting in the comments section of this webinars page in the archive section at www.connectedlearning.tv. And on that same page later today, we'll have a full recording of this webinar and other curated event. Other curated content. Let me just finish by saying that our next Connected Learning TV webinar will be on Thursday, December 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, that's 12 noon Eastern, with Julie Shore, who's also a member of the Connected Learning Research Network. And we will be examining how connected learning principles translate to our consumer economy. So again, thank you everyone, and thank you, Julian, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.